welcome to the TruthLover, a podcast, a video podcast presented by Love and Truth Party. I'm your host, Will Pye, author, speaker, transformational coach, workshop and retreat leader, and founder of Love and Truth Party. Love and Truth Party is a self-organizing, self-replicating community and movement of love and awakening, a wisdom school facilitating health, healing, and happiness, liberating humanity from the matrix of fear and self-loathing. Find us and join our mailing list at loveandtruthparty.org. We exist to empower the deep realization and integration of unitive consciousness of one human being, and to inspire action in the world from this clarity as New Earth Ninjas, our playful avatar. We do so in the spirit of play, holding the paradox that all is well, even and including all collective crises, whilst simultaneously being moved to act, to lessen suffering and serve the creation of conscious culture and society. Our projects include distributing 1 million love letters from the universe, inviting people to receive the love and care in these, and within the happiness hacks, including the 7 questions and other free resources found on loveandtruthparty.org. I'm really delighted today to be joined by a dear friend and extraordinary human being, Carole Griggs. Carole Griggs, Ph.D, is an author, speaker, and leader in the areas of professional coaching, human potential, and consciousness evolution. She is co-founder of iConscious.global and the iConscious Human Development Model and Assessment, an integrative meta framework developed to accelerate the process of maximizing full human potential. Dr. Griggs is a professor and course developer for John F. Kennedy's master's program in Consciousness and Transformative Studies, and is the author of Space to See Reality, a new model for professional coaches, and very recently also author of iConscious, Accelerating Human Potential, co-authored with business partner Ted. She's currently coaching leaders at Google, GoogleX, Wing, Waymo, and other Silicon Valley tech companies. Carole holds a Ph.D. in professional coaching and human development, and Carole's mission is to help streamline and accelerate conscious human development for the evolution of humanity's full potential through educational platforms and technology tools. Her vision is to help create a world in which awakening in all domains is the new normal. Wow, what a bio. Welcome, Carole. It's a privilege to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to see you as always, Will.
Yeah, a real pleasure. I'm glad I had the opportunity just to read out that bio prior to jumping on the recording. There's a lot of long words in there, and I felt that a rehearsal was advantageous. We had a little bit of a talk about what we might want to explore. And we talked about consciousness, the evolution of consciousness. And then I suggested that we sort of pin that down a little bit to, what did we say, non-duality, psychology, and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's been really alive for me, and it feels like it's like a distilled day-to-day aspect of the evolution of consciousness as well. So maybe to begin that, can you speak a little bit to what the evolution of consciousness is? I imagine most of our viewers and listeners would have some sense, oh yeah, I get that, but it's a pretty big concept, and I'd love to hear what that means for you, the evolution of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In basic terms, and we can expand and pick apart and add on, we are actually able to measure stages of consciousness, how expanded one's consciousness is or capacity, individually and collectively. So in my work, when I work with people one-on-one, I'm noticing what stage of development they're really operating from and how to help consciousness evolve individually and then also in groups. So whether they're working with a team at work or they're the CEO of a company, which I work with several of, and how that affects then their team and then their teams and their teams and their teams. And so you can really tell what stage of consciousness a company is operating from, as well as the individuals themselves. And so one of my one of the things I love to do is to help people expand their level of awareness, their level of consciousness, and how they see self, other, which is why I love bringing in relationship and world.
That's beautiful. And I guess that that's probably revelatory for many people, that there's this measurable aspect, because the evolution of consciousness, it sounds so big in time and in everything. I mean, it is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say it is everything. And yet there's a measurable quality, both individually, yes. And I think that's probably more accessible for people, because we get, well, maybe you can speak more about, because you've brought a really distinct form of measurement and assessment in the iConscious process. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you've developed that measurement tool, what it is, and then perhaps speak to the collective measurement aspect as well.
Sure. So my colleague Ted Strauss and I that developed the iConscious, just the company, and the iConscious assessment, the iConscious coach leader program, and then the iConscious book is all about really the evolution of consciousness, but it's also about the evolution of one's development in all 5 domains. So one is consciousness. One is uniqueness, your individual unique gifts and talents and ways of showing up in the world as consciousness expresses itself, as one of the many facets of the diamond, if you will. Heart and emotional intelligence and emotional capacity. And as that expands and grows and evolves, and what does that look like? Mind, which the way we define mind is probably pretty different than a lot of people do, but what we're pointing at with mind is our relationship to thought and thinking and belief structures, and how that evolves and changes and develops over time.
So cognitive capacity or cognitive intelligence, would that be?
Cognitive capacities, yeah. Yeah, but it's not IQ. It's nothing to do with really, your capacity there. I mean, I work with a lot of people at Google and Apple and everything, and extremely intelligent people in one realm when it comes to their mind is just brilliant, and they are identified with their mind. So that's more what we're speaking to, is what is the relationship with the mind, how much they identify as the mind, is where we can measure and see where people's kind of degree of freedom with mind is. And then body, embodiment is the last one. So when we talk about the evolution of consciousness, we can talk about it as its own thing, and then we can talk about it also as part of all the domains. And one of the courses that Ted and I teach or have taught in the past is the evolution of consciousness and human development at John F. Kennedy. And it's very much the evolution of consciousness is over here, and human development is over here. Those are kind of 2 schools. And so one of the things that we were really adamant about was bringing those 2 schools together and saying we need to look at all of them. It's not just one or, what happens when, the human development aspects are developed and consciousness is not tended to, or when consciousness is tended to, and I'm up on a mountaintop for 30 years and I ignore all other aspects of my being. What happens to that human being as they engage in the world, or as the title of this whole talk is Nonduality, Psychology, and Relationship. Because a lot of the work I do is individually consciousness and human development, and in relationship. How do you lead people? How do you lead yourself? How do you lead others? How do you lead a company? And how does my stage of consciousness affect everything I do and every decision that's being made? So we can look at it from many angles, if you will, in terms of development as a whole being. That's why we call it whole being awakening. It's not just consciousness awakening, it's whole being awakening, because we can start to see issues when there are discrepancies in development, when we assess people and where they are and what they've tended to. Because, people tend to lean into and develop further the things that they're strong at, and they tend to not notice or not pay attention to or not value the parts of them that are underdeveloped, which causes an even further gap, and then other issues in how they show up in the world. So part of what we do is help people to acknowledge the parts of them that are a little less developed and start to lean into that, so that they can start to integrate a little bit better and feel more whole in how they show up in the world.
Is that similar to shadow work? It sounds like those areas where I'm underdeveloped would be my shadow, would be parts of me that I haven't given attention to and I'm not so aware of. So like an assessment tool would help me become aware of where I might want to be giving more focus and attention?
Yeah, now a little bit different. Great question. A little bit different. I mean, a shadow could be like you know, I'm not good enough, or some part of ego, you know, or some part of an insecurity, or yeah, really an ego that's running something that we can't see. We're talking more of like the 5 domains, in terms of some people don't tend to emotional intelligence at all. So it's not just a piece of us, like a story of us, or a part of us, like I'm not enough or I am enough, or success or failure, and those polarities, as much as it is, you know, all of emotional intelligence can be ignored, especially in Silicon Valley, in the tech world, where you have people that really value the mind, and the mind is why they're being hired. And now people are realizing that they're hitting a glass ceiling in their career, because they don't know how to relate to people. Emotional intelligence isn't online. The degree of emotions that are allowed to be here, and the spectrum that is available to them without them shutting down, or getting triggered, is pretty narrow. So I think, yeah, it is a part of us, but it's like the, I don't know that I would call that as necessarily part psychology as much as other specific things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. There's an aspect that came forth from your description of this course, and the marrying or the integrating of human development and the evolution of consciousness, that feels really juicy and exciting from a perspective of meaning. Like in a world where we're searching for meaning, where many experience no meaning, I think in the non-duality space there is a tendency towards a nihilism or a nothingness without
Absolutely.
distinction as to what that really means. And I'm intrigued by the power and the profundity of the meaning of my human development and the evolution of consciousness being symbiotic, being being one and the same in many respects. So
yeah,
as I evolve, I'm contributing to human consciousness evolving in some way. Is that a fair characterization in your view?
absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I've noticed that the people that have, you know, and you can, if you're tuned to it, you can feel it in them, where consciousness is very awake. It's when awakening has shown itself and woken up to itself as itself in you, then it's pretty easy to recognize it in another being. And so consciousness can be very awake in somebody, and yet emotionally just not able to actually handle much without getting triggered, shutting down, or inability to sit present and fully open with all the emotions that arise. It can be just very kind of a heady almost awakening, rather than a full body awakening. So Ted and I kind of coined the term conscious human development, because we didn't really want the sense even of division of human development and evolution of consciousness, like the East and the West. Whereas it really is conscious human development, and how it all comes together and affects each other, if you will. You know, you can have a beautiful, huge consciousness awakening, but if there are other domains of your being that aren't awakened and evolving, it will affect everything you do, actually.
And what immediately springs to mind for me, and I suspect for many listening or watching, I came off a conversation that's a fairly regular conversation these days, as a new guru or spiritual leader being exposed for some you know, really significant ethical issue, usually around sex or power or money. And it feels like this might be one of the obvious negative effects when someone has perhaps had a very powerful non-dual realization, a very powerful state shift or stage shift, and yet they're less developed when it comes to their sexuality or their emotionality or their father-mother issues, whatever else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why Ted and I call like the lack of integration, where you can feel, and I keep kind of doing this, our assessment is top down like that. And so as consciousness evolves, if other parts of one's being is not evolved, integration issues typically causes integrity issues, because there isn't an alignment with one's whole being. There are gaps. And actually, as a teacher, it can just be so detrimental to students, because there is this awakening it can be so clear that the student can take the teacher like baby with the bathwater kind of a thing. It's like as everything they say and do is completely aligned and whole and right and free, and they know more and know better because they can see more, they're more aware or whatever. Whereas it's really not that it's not that true. But for students, it can be hard to tease out those things when there is such a big awakening in the teacher. And like you said, power, money, sex, those are the kinds of things that start to come up with integration issues.
So in a utopian future, everyone will take this clear self-assessment. Results will be publicly shared. So
there you go.
Right. So we can go to a teacher and go, hey, look, I'm here for your non-dual clarity, but I'm aware of your emotional issues as well. Or I'm being flippant, but I think there's actually a power in this, right?
I actually think there is too.
People that are in a leadership role or a teacher role, and for students to be more aware, to be
absolutely. And different teachers provide different things. Some teachers really have had a very clear awakening, and there is no me, and there's a whole it's more Advaita Vedanta, that there is no me, and it's very clear in that way. But when it comes to the human side of that person, there's often a disregard for emotion per se, or for the body. And so for the student to be really aware of where this teacher's level of development is, because oftentimes when somebody's had an awakening, they think that's it. I made it, I'm there. And they preach that, and it can cause some misunderstandings along the way.
It feels like there's something really important there, because enlightenment or realization or non-dual realization often is perceived to be the pinnacle, the ultimate, the only thing, and therefore we seek, in order to have this experience or have this shift or have this alteration in our consciousness occur. And what I'm feeling is that it's really not actually all that. It's really not that. There's so much more, both in the sense of different domains and also of beyond that initial realization, including the embodiment of that and the psychological integration of that into like, how does that actually work? Because how does going entirely beyond a psychology get integrated into the psychology? Is that a valid question? Or?
It's a total valid question. I love it. And I think there is this kind of awakening to this non-dual awakening that can arise and really even substantiate while the psychology is still trying to get caught up and integrated, because it all has to be integrated. It all is one, and it all needs to be integrated. And in the iConscious model, we actually have 15 stages of development. To give you perspective, stage 7 is awakening. So it's an initial awakening that actually doesn't quite substantiate. It's kind of an awakening that's like one of those moments of realization, really, that that a sense of self is shifts completely. And it's still in what we call the dual phase. So it's still a dualistic experience, because in stage 8, it's that oscillation between got it, lost it, I am this allness, nothingness, spaciousness. And then you're kind of back to this limited sense of self and all the thinking mind and all of that. And then in stage 9, it's really, it's a unity. It's like the conscious awakening really lands in the system in a way that isn't oscillating anymore. But the interesting thing is, what we notice is whatever psychological patterns that have not yet been integrated, or any shadows that are not yet in the level of awareness, will even come up after awakening. So it's either going to be before or after. There's pros and cons to both. Or a lot of people, they did a lot of work a lot of psychological work prior to awakening, which will make the integration maybe a little smoother afterwards because they've done a lot of the work. However, once somebody has had an awakening, there is much more space to hold some of the difficult patterns, psychological patterns, to arise and be integrated, because of the sense of self is just expanded tremendously, that there's room for it, which does make it easier in a sense as well. So after the unification, there is what we call a stage of transformation, where any patterns, it's what I call like a flashlight coming down through the body, and any stuck dualities or stuck contractions where the system even closes in the tiniest bits, like shining the light of awareness on those spots to open them up to its vast open spaciousness. And so those all need to come up to the light of awareness to be integrated and loosened. And so it's an ongoing process for a lot of people. And there does come a point, though, I've noticed with myself and other people, where a good bit of the psychological has been integrated, and there is a real substantial settling in the system, which is the same space in the system as outside the, the system. And there's just not the density in the body. The body is very empty and yet full. A lot of times we get stuck in the empty. So it's empty, but it is incredibly full of vitality. And sometimes people think that this emptiness is hollow or dead, but it's not. It's the most alive emptiness and full emptiness. I love calling it like the fullness of emptiness is typically the experience.
It feels like and I can certainly say in my own experience that where I discover where I'm still carrying some solidity in the body, or where I discover there is still a psychological patterning at play, is in relationship. It's when I'm in communication with others, whether in a professional role as facilitator or leading a group. But for me, I think that's a learning experience, but more so when I'm in intimate relationships, when I'm exploring romance and love with another. That seems to be where I learn more about myself.
I think every human being on this planet would likely agree with that.
Yeah, I'm feeling that I'm not alone in that.
No, you're not alone in that.
And it makes perfect sense. And there's a beautiful work that I've been playing with and contemplating with, which is the key word they focus on, called the gene keys. And in this, they speak about the path of relationships as having the potential to be, equal to the path of meditation or the path of devotion, or that it is in itself potentially such a facilitator, such a rich laboratory for human development and the evolution of consciousness. And yet it feels that in a lot of the non-dual world that you and I have traversed, both through our development, but also in our cultural expressions and communities and so on, it feels as often a devaluing of that, or a devaluing of anything that would have any sort of semblance of personal. And of course, in a relationship, there is nothing more personal than this two people coming together. But how I guess a question arises from that, or an inquiry: how important is it that two individuals relating are at a comparative stage of development? Is it possible for people at 7 and 10 to actually have a solid, authentic partnership, or will one rise, or will one fall? I mean, what's your sense as to how the rubber really hits the road there in human relating and relationship?
That's a great question. I think I recall Ken Wilber, from Integral Theory, Ken Wilber mentioning that at one stage difference is doable, maybe a little bit of a rub, but 2 stages apart can be challenging, and beyond that is very difficult. I'm not sure I agree with that or not. I will say one of the patterns I've noticed is the lower you are in development, the more obvious the gap. Kind of like when you're 16 years old and you're dating a 19-year-old, that's like a huge gap. But when you're 40 and you're dating a 43-year-old, it's like you barely notice it. That's been my experience. When the more evolved you are, if somebody's had an awakening and they're working on embodiment stuff and they're just in that realm, and somebody is a few steps ahead, I don't find that that's as big of a deal. So long as there's an openness and a curiosity and an awareness of awareness, and I don't find that gap to be as big of a rub. Earlier stages, yes, because you really value very different things, and one's identity is wrapped up much more tightly in different things, and can cause a lot of the scuffles, and also the inability to communicate about it and talk about it openly and be mature enough to have a conversation and stay present without, getting scared and leaving. I mean, there's a lot that it can get messy in the earlier stages. But it is interesting with relationship and how it really is where the rubber hits the road. I mean, it's whatever shadows that you have or I have. If I'm just sitting here in my office and meditating, I may have something float by that's a little uncomfortable that I can look at. But for the most part, it's not in my face. But when you're relating intimately with somebody and you love them dearly and you're very vulnerable and open and sharing raw material, and somebody shows you a shadow, intentionally or not, it can be challenging. It can be very challenging. It's the dance. That dance can be much more rich and much more threatening than when you're just by yourself or you don't have somebody that's intimately close to you.
Yeah, right. So it becomes an essential means by which we see things about ourselves that maybe we just haven't seen or been conscious of. I mean, you spoke to a typical shadow of, I'm not enough, or I'm a failure, and that's certainly one that's been alive for me. And in fact, I recall an experience with someone where I was beginning to explore an intimacy, and this came out really strong for me. And it was like, wow, the unskillfulness of it in the relating was really noticeable. And in terms of allowing me to become aware of that aspect of psychology still in operation, still felt to be true, was really not disturbing, unsettling in the moment, but ultimately helpful in seeing that aspect of myself, and seeing that was somewhere still held in the psychology and in the body.
When I don't remember if it was Rumi or who said, we're all here to take each other home.
Well, there's the Ram Dass quote that's
Maybe
been
it was
going
Ram
around.
Dass. Is that okay? Yeah.
We're all just walking each
That's
other.
it. That's it. That's exactly it. And I think I've heard even Eckhart Tolle say something along the lines of, relationships aren't here to make each other happy. We're here to help each other become more conscious. And if we can look at relationship from that perspective, it's a lot more freeing, because then we're not expecting this like bliss bunny all the time. It's more really like, let's wake up and grow up and evolve together, and how juicy and like enriched and enlivening that can be, to really love each other while we're waking up all different parts that are uncomfortable that we haven't been able to see on our own or in previous partnerships.
Right. And that perspective on relationships feels like, so we were talking about where there's a match and to what extent, if there's not a match developmentally, that can still be managed and can still support a fruitful, enjoyable partnership. It feels like the perspective that the fundamental function of relationship is to evolve and grow in consciousness. That, I suspect, is a belief or a view that is held at a certain stage, that if it's absent, like if I'm coming into a relationship thinking this is all about financial security and social status and my emotional needs being met, and my partner's coming in thinking this is about expansion in consciousness, and the only real reason for this is the increasing of awareness and the development of all these different domains, that's two very, very different agendas and perspectives and ideas of what this thing that we call relationship actually is in a fundamental sense. So it feels
Well, and then you're coming to the table, if that were you, you're coming to the table with wanting to evolve, wanting to talk about things, wanting to share your insecurities, wanting to talk about what you're noticing, wanting to meditate with your partner, wanting to, share these things with them and actually name things that are hard to say and hope that they can stand in presence and hear it and then respond, and both parties stay alive and present. And if you're really wanting that and all they really want is just to keep the peace and for things to look good on the outside and for financial security, neither party is actually going to get their needs met. It's not going to be a lasting partnership when agendas are that dramatically different.
Yeah, that feels sort of inescapable. So there's got to be a certain degree of coherence around why we are relating. Yes, it's for the pleasure and the happiness, but something more fundamental, more primary than that is what brings us together. That's always been my sense as to why a relationship would happen, is that it's facilitating the mutual growth in a profound way of each individual. And so long as that's happening, in my view, the relationship is a good, functional, healthy relationship. And I guess the real gift is when you discover a relationship where that's mutually facilitated, ongoing, where there's a sustainable over many years potential for that. And I guess starting with that intentionality, that the reason we are coming together, the reason we are exploring intimacy and partnership is for that to be the case, would help increase the likelihood of that evolution and development being ongoing and being sustained.
Yeah, I would think so. And especially when something arises that's uncomfortable, somebody gets triggered, for the other one to lean in and actually enjoy it, actually look for it, look to support them. And the other one to be willing to stay present to the trigger and be there and work through it together. That both would see that as opportunity, not as a problem in the relationship. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces, is do both parties see it as a problem? Hey, you're getting in the way of my financial security. You're getting in the way on how this looks on the outside. Or, hey, you're getting in the way of my peace. I like things just easy on the surface. Whereas if the other person, if they're actually, both parties are seeing it as opportunity to lean in and both of them to grow and evolve and to learn, explore, and to discover, what an incredible relationship space to be in, but to not, if one wants it and one doesn't, that's going to be a challenge in terms of growth and evolution for both parties.
Yeah, what's coming up as you speak to that is how ill-equipped our dating software and technology and so on generally is to facilitate these distinctions. It's very much down to the individual, I think, to sort of discern, to read between the lines of what's on someone's profile or whatever, to really get clear as to whether there's a likelihood or a possibility that there'd be a shared desire for that sort of growth.
Now, I think you nailed it when you said, if it's a certain stage of development that's likely going to come online for somebody that will be interested in desiring that kind of partnership. And in my experience, that's very true. And Ted, my colleague, and I have been sort of joking, sort of maybe not joking, about using the iConscious assessment in dating. And what would happen if you each took you answer a bunch of questions on eHarmony or any of the other ones about, whether you like to play soccer or go for a run, and try to match you up based on, some of those things. So why not match you up on your stage of consciousness, your level of EQ, and those sorts of things that will actually in the end show the kind of person that would be interested in evolving together, because there is a stage of development where it really becomes non-negotiable that is the foundation of the kind of partnership they're going to be looking for.
Well, in the interests of serving the evolution of consciousness, I'd be happy to volunteer as if you had 20 beautiful friends in California of a level of consciousness evolution, female, personally, that'd be my preference. I'd happily be the guy guinea pig in that, just to put that out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's sweet of you to offer your
it's the kind
services.
of nobility that's here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I think there would actually be massive potential in something more evolved than what I'm, at least what I'm aware of, is currently out there with those sorts of dating.
Yeah, and I mean, I can absolutely see the fruitfulness of that, because even when we run this assessment in corporations and we see the leadership team maybe of 10 people, and 2 of them are, say, in stage 4, the majority of them, maybe 8 of them, are in stage 5, and maybe 1 or 2 are in stage 6. And the challenges of bringing the team together to cohesively work as one is difficult because of the gap in development. So I can only imagine exponentially, when you put somebody in a romantic partnership, how that's going to be for those people to co-live together and maybe have children together and all that, what kinds of challenges may arise.
With those stage numbers, can you put a little bit of meat on the bones there as to, so that sounds
Sure.
like a fairly real example. Like, what are we talking about with stage 8, stage 5 and so on?
So stage 4 is, stage 3 is conforming. So if you think about, one example I like to use is like a 15-year-old girl, who has her girlfriends, and she's aware of herself and she's aware of her girlfriends and her tribe, if you will. But then there's everybody else's other. You're out. So her level of awareness is beyond self. So in stage 2, it's really about myself. I can really only see about myself. It's self-consuming, self-centric. That's what we call it. So stage 2 is conforming. So then we're able to look, we not only can see ourselves, we can see our group that we're calling us as part of our, identity. Stage 4 goes into rational striving. So stage 4 is really much more individual autonomy. It's less about the group and more the individual and the individual accomplishments. So it's if you look at corporate America, the typical, and maybe actually 10 years ago, corporate America, the typical is a stage 4. And it's all about striving every man for himself, trying to achieve, trying to be successful. And that's really their value. That's their identity. That's more important to them than anything else. And that evolves into stage 5, which goes back more into group harmony, but in a more expansive way. So people are now more interested in the planet, into animals, into the health of the world and other countries, and more oneness, harmony, equality. I see, you get a group of 5 stage 5 equality harmony people in a room in a business setting, because I work a lot in businesses. They have a very difficult time making decisions because everybody has a voice, everybody has a vote, and they really have a difficult time coming to consensus and then having one person really call the shot. And then stage 6 is what we call inclusive. So it's very integral. And stage 6 is the first time people actually have the capacity to see value in stage 5, 4, 3, and 2. Because they see that quality in themselves and they've integrated it in a healthy way. And they also see that one stage is not necessarily better or worse. Whereas like somebody in stage 4, they don't really like people in stage 5. And they don't really like people in stage 3. And same with people in stage 5. People in stage 5 really don't like people in stage 4. And they're not that interested in people in stage 6. So once you're in 6, there's an inclusivity where you're actually able to appreciate really all stages of development, and that they all have their place and time, and they're all just right exactly as they are. And I can find all of them in me. And it's just an integration of all of it. It's also a stage where we're able to integrate more emotion, more bandwidth of emotion, more bandwidth of beliefs, and more perspectives allowed in the room. I think we've all been in meetings or even with just friends, and one person has a perspective, and if you don't agree with it, like, it's not going to go very well. So stage 6 can really be a part of a conversation and hear 10 different perspectives, and they find that fascinating. They want to find more perspectives and integrate them all, feel them all, and then figure out what direction they want to go. It doesn't create a threat because there's enough room and space for all of it to be here. So every stage of development is an expansion of consciousness, an expansion of emotional capacity, an expansion of cognitive capacities. So if you've got one person in stage 3 and another in 6, yeah, the person in 6 is going to have a much larger capacity than somebody in 3, which will feel a lot more limiting and small and tight, and it's just more challenging.
A question that arises in that, you mentioned the sort of group of people in stage 5, and there's great awareness, but there's also, you know, awareness of the validity of everyone else's views, and maybe decisions aren't being made. What's coming to mind is how an organization will be successful with a reduction often in hierarchy, and to what extent some hierarchy is necessary. And the book that comes to mind is Reinventing Organizations by Lelou, where it's like just really wow examples of what that actually looks like. And to make this question perhaps a little bit long, I'm interested also in this Love and Truth Party collective community that my friends and I have been exploring. There's been this desire for it to be self-organizing and self-replicating. So we're looking to be very light upon any sort of structure or means by which we would be telling anyone else this is how it's done. Yet in order for someone else to do it, often there's a need for them to be told how it's done. So, and there's a need for someone to be driving and leading. Yet there's a desire amongst the individuals that there not be too much of a strong hierarchy, or certainly no guru figure or a CEO who's calling all the shots. So I'm not sure if there's a question in there, but like, what does that actually look like in the organization that you're working with?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a real common question for somebody who's at least in stage 6, which is integrative, inclusive. Now, stage 4 is a lot the autonomy, and it's a lot of top down. So it's the old school corporate America, which is very, very structured and top down in terms of authority and power and how things are done and whatnot. And that is still a very prominent structure in the world. Because a lot of countries operate at a stage 4, and you can see it. It's just really obvious when you understand the stages of development. You can go to different countries and different companies, and you walk in, and within 10 minutes, you know what stage the company is operating from. Stage 5 is more, you're right, it's a flattening of hierarchy. There's kind of a dislike for hierarchical structures, and so there's a flattening that can happen. Like holacracy is more of a flattening, less managerial stages and steps within the system. And then a 6 is exactly what you're trying to describe, which Reinventing Organizations gets into, which is what is the integration of autonomy and group harmony, and hierarchy, no hierarchy. You know, it's the classic polarities coming together, you know, all the polarities coming together. And how do you integrate those in a healthy way where it's functional? And it's not dog eat dog and top down, but it's also not with no leadership and nobody stepping forward. And so it is that combination. And so there are structures that can be put in place with that. And you have to have leaders that are at least operating at a stage 6 in order to run a stage 6 company, period. You cannot have somebody in 5 running and hope that you're going to have an integrative, the structure won't mirror that, and nor will the people or the operations. I mean, it all has to be created from that stage of consciousness in order for it to be manifesting from that stage of consciousness.
In your observations and in the research, is it sufficient that there only be a leader at the stage 6 or higher? I mean, is it possible that because in that Reinventing Organizations book, there are some really huge companies. I think one of them's got 40,000 employees from recollection. So this is very much happening on scale. And I'm wondering, either with that specific example or with ones you're more familiar with, perhaps, like, is it possible that an individual raise the level of, or create it? I mean, if we're going to categorize an organization or a country, like let's really tighten this down. Let's say someone comes into the presidency of the United States at a level of 6 or above, like,
amazing,
right? What might we expect to see culturally, collectively, or if you prefer, take it down to a smaller, corporation, because a country is a pretty huge thing, to say the least.
Yeah. I don't know the research on it, the data specifically. I know that Ken Wilber, the American philosopher, has named 10% as the tipping point for a culture to shift into that higher stage, that is all that's needed. I don't know if that's true or not. It feels like, in my experience in working with companies, it feels like that would be enough. Where like at the state of California or Google or whatever, if 10% of the population, particularly at the top that are making decisions and creating the structures, are operating at a stage 6, they could really shift the whole company to operate as a stage 6 company. And I would agree with that. I would really agree with that. There really aren't that many companies that are operating fully from a stage 6. I mean, I think in Reinventing Organizations, they use 4, 5, 6 examples of companies. And that was maybe, I don't know, that book was written quite a bit ago, maybe 8 years ago or something. And so I'm sure there are a handful more. I've seen a couple, but for the most part, you'll see pockets. Google is just a huge company. So to use them as an example, they have pockets within the company that are operating at a 6. They're primarily a 5 company. They're primarily a equality, harmony company that does have some 4 still in them and does have some 6 in them. Whereas like an Amazon, for example, is really a stage 4. It's really like, that's just the way it operates. But within Google, and I don't work for Amazon, so I don't know, but within Google, you'll have departments that are operating at a 6, and maybe finance is operating at a 4, or, I mean, Google is so big. And so you can have teams, individual teams operating at a different stage, but then they have a difficult time when they have to cross function with like the sales, because or product, and they're operating at a 4 and these guys are operating at a 6. It can be difficult for them to really cohesively come up with a plan and functionally work well together. So that's primarily what I've seen in some of the bigger companies. Smaller companies, like I think in Reinventing Organizations, it was Sounds True, Morningstar, a few others, and those are smaller companies. And so I think a 10% tipping point is probably an easier thing than like a Google. But Google is operating from primarily a 5, which is great considering. The percent of the population, I think it's like 15-20% of the population in the world is operating at a 5. Most people in the world are operating at a 3 or even a 2, to give you perspective in terms of worldwide where humanity is. So people operating at a 6 is like, I think the last I saw was like 10%, 8%. And then a stage 7 was like 0.01% or something like that. And those numbers are old, and I don't even know if they've been verified. So a little side note on that.
Sure. It feels hopeful that, even just to play with the notion that a smaller portion, a non-majorative portion of an organization or a population of a community or a country, shifting significantly in their state and stage of development, can be expected to have impact and effects from a non-coercive, in a non-coercive means, to other people at lower stages of development. So what I mean by that is, it's very easy to look at, go to a shopping mall or turn on cable TV and despair as to where humanity is heading. And yet we know that an individual in a family, and I think this is maybe easier for us to identify with or observe, an individual in a family or in a community group who's really operating from an extraordinary level of consciousness can have an effect upon that field, upon that group, that's powerfully transformative. And my interest, and this is part of the experiment with Love and Truth Party and the exploration, is like, what is the means by which that transformation occurs? So there's the obvious mechanistic stuff, right? So let's say someone becomes president or CEO, and they're at a stage 6, and they decide to bring in more egalitarian decision-making processes, or so they change the structure in this way, or they change the education at a primary school level of children. So there's that mechanistic surface stuff that's observable and measurable. I'm intrigued also, like, each of us is an energy system. Each individual is an energy system. And when I shift from a strong self-identification to a more heart-centered, when my consciousness is in a different place in my locality, in my body, I am emitting, I am a different energy frequency that's going out into the world. And the Institute of Heart Math and the Princeton University, others have started to measure this and actually ground it in data. So can you speak to that a little bit, perhaps? Because this is what I certainly get very excited about. It is the potential when large numbers of people, or starting with one, me and my friends, when we do the work and when we consciously evolve ourselves, what can we speculate or perhaps look to in the data is happening in a non-physical or an energetic communication that's going out into the world? Is that something you'd be comfortable to speak to?
Yeah, I mean, our presence is constantly speaking. I love thinking about two people that speak a completely different language and cannot understand each other. And yet you sit with them, just two people facing each other, and there's so much being shared. There's so much being said, there's so much being felt, there's so much being understood, and there's so much mystery as well. You can really feel their openness, their closeness, their fear, their assertiveness, their curiosity. I'm not sure I could name their stage of consciousness without hearing them speak, but you can certainly start to feel into where they're operating from. Absolutely. And so if we think of it from that perspective, think about a mother who has children and a spouse and a community around her. If she's this awake being, how her presence, without even opening her mouth, how she moves, how she relates, how she touches and sees and feels, and how that can affect a whole community without even words. You know, we think it's the words. The words are just a manifestation of one's being. You know, that's why I find it incredibly important to help individuals, particularly the most powerful in Silicon Valley, when it comes to creating technologies, because the level of consciousness that I'm operating from is what level of development of the technology that's being exponentially blasted out in the world, especially when it comes to AI. Who's developing AI? A level of consciousness emanating from stage 3 or stage 2, self-centric, doesn't care about other people, not very empathetic? Or is it a stage 6? It's very inclusive and expansive and empathetic and curious and open. And I mean, it makes a huge difference. So one's being is really what's speaking. It's doing the communicating. The words are just a manifestation. You know, Lovinger, researcher from way back in the day, and Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who worked with Lovinger. Suzanne Cook-Greuter is a dear colleague of ours. She's a beautiful scholar on ego development, and she's written a boatload of books. And if you're an academic nerd into ego development, I highly recommend her. But be prepared for academic jargon if you read her stuff. But she came up with a sentence completion test, SCT, or maybe Lovinger did, which means that was their way of measuring stages of consciousness, was how you spoke, the words you use, like how dualistic are the words that are coming out of your mouth. It shows perspective. It shows how you see and feel and experience the world. which gave us insight into the level of development consciousness is operating in that individual. Yeah, you can use language as a means, but really, sitting and feeling one's being. There's a reason people are drawn to certain people, as they say, like, yeah, I was drawn to that person like bees to honey. It's like, wow, I want to know about their presence. I want to know about their beingness. I want to know what they were emanating and where they were operating as and from, because that's what's being drawn. Or if somebody is awake and lit up enough, it can actually, people might run. I've had that happen. Colleagues of mine who are non-dual teachers have had that happen, where it's just too much. It's like they feel seen through, and it's too exposing and too threatening. And they just want to disappear, and that's okay too. But so one's beingness, I mean, I've also heard of plenty of people who have had realizations and awakenings that speak about their experience with their teachers, of going and just sitting with them and just feeling the transmission of their presence. Adyashanti was my primary teacher for a decade. And just going to his retreats and just sitting in his presence was, there was something very powerful for me in that. So I do think that presence is extremely powerful and way underestimated. That's why you struck a chord. Like my dissertation for my Ph.D. ended up into my book, Space to See Reality. It's all about how the coach shows up. How does the coach identify themselves, and how that impacts the transformational possibilities with the client. So it's incredibly powerful.
A teacher of mine in the coaching space feels appropriate to mention a gentleman called Alan Seal, and he is the director of the Center for Transformational Presence, which in language really captures the potential and capacity that you're pointing to and have written about and are facilitating it on scale. It is mysterious and somewhat magical that seemingly, I think, certainly from a dualistic perspective, but as we understand the nature of reality and physicality and energy and so on, more not so magical, that an individual can walk into a room and shift the state of consciousness of other people in that room.
Absolutely.
When there's a readiness or a ripeness. Like I think that's, and that's hard to predict, but it does seem that there are some that are ready and ripe and some that aren't. And when you were speaking to the being too much, funnily enough, bringing the non-duality into their relationships, I've had the experience. I love eye gazing. I know you do. I know you do as well. To really drop in and connect presence to presence, presence as presence, and there's a just deliciousness of beingness enjoying itself. Now I've been on dates when
you blew them out.
I start to do that because
I know, freaks them out.
It's natural, and I've had people say
to you,
right. Why are you looking at me like that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no.
Another one bites the dust.
This probably doesn't have the potential to move forward.
It's too threatening. It's too, their system is too tight. And your system is so expansive. It literally, their system can't handle it.
So maybe this is the beyond an overly complex assessment. You just put two people together for that initial 30-second. I mean, I guess we're back to speed dating, really, aren't we? Like that little 30-second taste or 5-minute taste, which in my experience generally is enough to get a big yes or a big no.
I agree.
As to whether I'd want to continue conversation with.
I agree. I remember when I was dating, I would drop a new gaze with them very intentionally. And I had this curiosity, like, can they sit with me? I want to meet them in the middle. I want to meet them in presence. And can they meet me in presence? Or does it scare them? Is it too much? Am I too much? Is it too much?
Mm.
Or, for some people it's too much and other people are like, this is amazing, and they lean in. So it's really a beautiful way to weed people out, find people that really are a match. Can I drop in a vast presence with you? And can we relax there together? Can we meet there? Can we connect in this oneness? Which oneness sounds funny, to connect in oneness. It's like inherently dualistic, but what a great way to sink in and really, really connect with another being and feel whether it's a match.
It feels like there's you use the word emanation or emanating, and it feels like this is something of what's happening in relating one-on-one and in an organization and beyond. There's an emanation being offered, a frequency being emitted, and that's being, I guess, by the collective vibration or consciousness or the electromagnetic frequency of reality that is being received. So our emission, our emanation is, whether receivable by the individual or not, it's being broadcast. So this just feels, so important as we look to create.
What are we broadcasting?
Yeah, what are we broadcasting?
We are constantly broadcasting our stage of consciousness, constantly. Constantly. You look at like a stage 4 company, for instance, and they're broadcasting stage 4. They attract stage 4 employees. They retain stage 4. They hire stage 4s because 4s value the same thing as other 4s. They find a match. It's the cultural match. And stage 5, the same thing. Stage 5s have a hard time hiring stage 4s, and sometimes get threatened by 6s, sometimes love 6s, sometimes don't. But a stage 6 will have a difficult time working for a stage 4. It'll feel tight, limiting. So we are absolutely emanating our stage of awareness all the time, whether we know it or not. It's happening in just walking down the street. This is a great question to wake up with. What am I emanating?
Yeah.
What am I broadcasting? I'm broadcasting my beingness, my stage of development.
I'm hearing the bird song in the background and
I heard that too.
Feeling like there's a sweet completion in our conversation. I could dialogue with you for hours and hours, and I know that we each have schedules. It's New Year's Eve over in California, so many of us, I think this will probably be broadcast a couple of weeks into 2020, but maybe there's a question for us all to sit with there. What are we emanating? What are we broadcasting? And I love the notion of starting each day with that as a
and what a beautiful way to start the year. What am I broadcasting this year?
And just perfectly, I'm in 2020 here in Australia. You're still in 2019, so there's this wonderful bridging integration oneness of time that's
It's funny, isn't it? Yeah,
it is funny. That's got to be accelerating human potential, which is bringing people back to your book, and everyone will be able to see your website and details, of course, on the various notes that we offer. So Carole, look, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure and a delight to be with you.
Likewise.
Have a wonderful last few hours of your last day of 2019.
Thank you. Enjoy your first day of 2020.
So far, so good. So far, so good.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for our listeners and viewers for listening and watching. You can visit loveandtruthparty.org to join our community, download or order love letters, register for our newsletter, connect on social media, and even consider financial support at loveandtruthparty.org. Thank you to all our existing supporters and contributors. Together, we're creating kind, conscious, courageous human community.